Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Interfaith Paths to Peace. This is our last of our 4-week series on integral life and leadership, cultivating a path for personal and social transformation. And glad to have you all back and joining us. I want to also give a big shout out to my wonderful conversation partners, so that I'll have them introduce themselves in a moment. And those of you that are joining us on Zoom or on Facebook, it's always good to have you. This is the last of a series that we've been doing. If you're interested in that series, they'll be up on the Interfaith Paths to Peace website, and you can go and check them out there. If you haven't seen the other ones that we've done, that's a good resource for you. If you're joining us on Facebook, I would invite you to put in a comment or a chat, and we'll help and bring you into the conversation that we're having. It's always nice to extend the resources and the reflection. So please add a comment or a question. And also, those of you that are joining us on Zoom, we'll invite you to join in on the conversation a little bit later in our program. But yeah, thanks for being a part of this journey. And so welcome. Today we are going to be looking at applying these maps to creating an integral city, specifically Louisville, but the work is being taken from some ideas that have been percolating in a movement called integral cities. So I would encourage you, and I'll show you a resource for that in a moment. Before we jump in, I would like for my conversation partners to introduce themselves. So Wes, Alicia, and David, if you all would introduce yourself, and then I've asked them to think about an idea or a theme or something that's emerged over the last 3 weeks that feels really juicy to them or important to them, or that's kind of got them thinking. So yeah, you all introduce yourself. Wes, they picked you to go first. So Wes, would you mind introducing yourself? And thanks again for being a conversation partner.
Good afternoon. My name is Westerfield Tolbert. Jad and all of you call me Wes. I'm representing a mind of valor, a service that I coach entrepreneurs and entertainers and artists so they can, I say, untether their imaginations. When thinking about what kind of caught me over the last couple of weeks, I recognize that it's important when we're building with people that we start from a place of their values. And if we can start there, then we can integrate better where people really reside and where they dwell, not just on the surface level, and allow that space to move towards their highest aspirations. And we can really get to a point of producing the environments and ecosystems that are necessary to have the brave conversations that foster integral alignment and improving cities. With that, people can bring their best selves and really facilitate deep integral work around worldviews and really progressing the necessary change in the narrative.
Great. Thanks, Wes. Good insights. Alicia, how about you? Thanks for being a conversation partner the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you. That was great, Wes, what you said. But I will also add some insights. My name is Alicia Hollinger, and I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm interested in questions that center around healthy relationships within ourselves, with each other, and our one home, if we were to sum it up very simply. As far as the insights that I have been gleaning over the past few weeks, I think what I will noodle on and continue to noodle on are the tension points. And we talked a little bit about this last week. And that is just to really think about the tension points when it comes to power dynamics, when it comes to resistance work. That's something that I have been thinking through even over the past week in my work when thinking about transformation and, the different levels and scopes of change that we all work at different points in our work. So those are the two insights. And then the third one is really getting at awareness, which really encapsulates so many different things as far as just the necessary skills that we need to build in order to deepen our consciousness and shift towards more of an integrated perspective and approach, is just the work that goes into building the skills for individuals, but also for groups to be able to have not only self-awareness, but other awareness, and what that looks like and what that means. And awareness seems like such a simple word for what really is very critical and important, and actually is pretty complex. So those are the three insights.
Thanks, Alicia. And Dave, also, for those of you that are watching, know that Alicia is coming to us from Florida. So at some point, if we just block her because we're tired of seeing the sun reflect off her face, understand that's why we dropped her, because we're all jealous. Dave, thank you for being a partner, and introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, and it's been my pleasure. My name is David Graffi. I do leadership coaching currently, and it uses an integral framework. So this subject is interesting and important to me. And I think what stands out mostly for me is how much interest folks have had, and it's really sparked for me about what might continue from here, from our conversations. And then in terms of the material itself, I'm still reflecting on and find that the conversation we had in the first session around shadow and trauma. And so I've been wondering how that impacts that personal subjective space, and what might help each of us open up more towards those dimensions of ourselves that we put aside and we don't want to look at. So how do we befriend those? How do we make peace with those? How do we see them more clearly? And for me, this is a bit of a deconstruction of identity, which then gets to be a very complicated, almost overwhelming process for me. Especially if you're not just doing it just to get out of maybe the pain of the shadow, but actually to live a more authentic life. So that piece has been continuing to nag at me, mostly because of my own shadow and traumas.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, I kind of want to echo one of the things that's continued to emerge for me is that shadow work. In fact, some people have said that the integral life practice, which we looked at the first week, that really what was powerful that integral was adding to this already, a lot of people have this kind of integrative health where you look at body, mind, and spirit kind of thing. And they added this element of soul or shadow work. And a lot of people said that was one of the most transformative things about the integral movement, specifically around integral life practice, is the work with the shadow. And I think that's, if there's one kind of capacity to cultivate integral leadership, you're going to have to work with shadow material, because that's the whole idea of being able to bring your whole self online. And a lot of these parts that we've shadowed are really important for us to be integrated thinkers, and also to be able to work with different people. It's probably the one thing that trips us up in relationships, whether they're work relationships, family relationships, or working relationships, is that our shadow is projected onto them, and therefore we have a hard time working with them. And so I don't think there's any work we can do to be integral leaders that doesn't include some form of shadow work or psychotherapy, or however you want to kind of understand that. So thanks.
Yeah, Judd, I want to add a little bit to that. I read this past week something that says, until we can be fully present and presence our own shadow, we will never really be able to presence another human being.
Yeah. That's so, yeah. And that presencing word is so important when we look at this integral work. is the ability to be fully present to what's emerging. And that's, I really think what we mean by integral leadership is you're able to rest in, be present to more and more reality, both the reality of yourself, the reality of the other, and the reality of the system. And so this presencing word that you used is really important. Well, thank you all. Again, it's been a joy. I've been stating that the reason for doing this is because I do think it's imperative that Louisville create an integrative community of practice. And so I hope going forward, Dave, that we can continue to build on this and invite people into integral leadership. And we can talk about ways that'll happen. But this was kind of a dipping our toe into that work and then seeing, how Louisville responds. Again, form follows consciousness. And I think that we're not going to create a more integrated city until we have people who can come together and can be integral thinkers or integral beers, because it's when we come together that we can create forms, artifacts. We can create structures out of that consciousness that allow the city to move into that more easily. And so, as we said, it's kind of like building the airplane while we're flying it. These levels of consciousness really do have to produce a certain number of people have to be able to do that kind of work, and then they need to come together in order to create things. And so my hope is and that's really where the focus goes today, if we're going to create an integral city, we need an integral community of practice. So thank you all for being a part of that. And our journey together has been personally rich for me. So thank you. So let's jump into, as I have had before, let's jump into some slides, and I'll do a little teaching here and then open it up for conversation. So the subject today is integral city, and specifically looking at what are the 7 different cities in Louisville. So this is the idea of worldviews, that there are actually 7 cities in Louisville, each with their own operating system, each with their own value set. And so we're going to look at some of those. This is just a section from this, what's called the integral city movement. Marion Hamilton has taken the integral models and maps and then applied them to city work. Everything from architecture to government to social service to nonprofits to faith communities, trying to give some maps that we can use to bring integral awareness and integral interventions to places where the city may be stuck. And so we're going to look today at some maps that we can apply to the city of Louisville and have some conversation about that. One of the ideas here is, and this is what I meant by a community of practice, Beck and Cohen, who came out with the book, Spiral Dynamics, called them spiral wizards. And so they say that spiral wizards instinctively roam over vast landscapes, seeing patterns and connections others do not notice because they're old paradigm, or Dave, what we would say, because it's in their shadow and they can't see it. And that's often the first tier filters don't allow them to see it. And they can move through the spine of the spiral, awakening, unblocking, and empowering or repairing each of the memes or the value sets or worldviews and the genetic or cultural codes. So that's really what I'm hoping we can develop, is a group of spiral wizards that can look at our city and can diagnose where we seem to be blocked, and then can make integral types of actions to unleash those blocks or help heal areas where the city is broken. One of the things that I'm taking some of this work is also from, there's several really great books, and a lot of these slides that you're about to see are taken from this Urban Hub. It's a series of books that has some great slides on it. So I would recommend you can just Google Urban hub or integral. Paul Van Schaak, I think that's how you say his name, from Integral Mentors, came out with these really beautiful slides. And so the slides I'm going to be showing today, he created, and they're part of a workbook, a series of books that you may want to take a look at if you're interested in doing more work in this area. There's not a lot of narrative to them. They're mainly just slides. And so you would have to overlay it with some other narrative work or reading on integral theory for them to make sense. But they're beautiful slides, and so I want to give a thanks to him that they come from his work. So what we're going to be looking at today is really 4 maps. So we're going to be looking at this spiral dynamics map, the worldview map, and we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of a city or cities within a city. So the idea is that each of these worldviews is a city in of itself with its own operating system, and within the city of Louisville. And so we'll talk about, go back through these worldviews. So that's going to be one of the maps we're using. Another map, and what we're going to be doing with those maps is trying to see where is the center of gravity in Louisville, as far as if you take a city like Louisville, you can ask the question, where is the center of gravity with government? Where's the center of gravity with in geographies, in organizations? Because that's how you map out an intervention, or what that that group or area or sector may need in order to move to a higher level of integration. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Where's the center of gravity in Louisville? Where's some areas that we may want to focus, fulcrum points for unblocking Louisville's conscious development? All the thing I'm going to also be looking at is what we call worldviews as far as from a leadership perspective. This comes from some work from Torbert's work on 7 transformative leadership styles. It's basically taking worldviews from a cultural perspective and applying them to individual leaders. And so he uses some stage models that follow, as you can see, some of the colors on the left of spiral dynamics. So we're also going to be looking at what are leaders in this worldview in order to know kind of how to connect with them. From an integral perspective, we need to be able to work with a variety of different leaders at different places. And so I'll show you some of the characteristics of these leaders so that we can have a better understanding of how we might work with them in integral solutions. So this is called action logics, but it's essentially individual leadership styles at different worldview stages. And so we're going to be looking at those as well. We're also going to be not doing a whole lot of work here, but this is back to the 4 quadrants model. We're going to be looking at these worldviews in their 4 quadrants. I don't want to get stuck here, but I think this is an important map. Again, the 4 quadrants, the upper left is intersubjective individual quadrant. So it's the I, and it's looking at their subjective experience, their values, what they perceive, their inner world. And again, we don't have access to that. That's subjective to each person. When you move to the right side in the top quadrant, that's objective individual, which means this is actions we can see. It's behaviors you can measure. It's the body and the brain. It's objective, so we can look at it together. We can apply, in some sense, traditional scientific methodologies to see it. So the top is individuals, we're people, and we're looking at their subjective and objective behaviors. And then the bottom part is the collective. It's a we. So we're looking at the bottom left is collective subjective. So this is what we call we space or intersubjectivity. This, again, we don't really have access to this in the same way because it doesn't, it shows up in the lower right as artifacts. This is cultural worldviews. And so we're looking a lot at this bottom left quadrant, how the cultural worldviews manifest in systems, levels of complexity. And that's the bottom right is systems. It's looking at the city and all of the physical systems that we can see. So we're going to be looking at each of the worldviews using these 4 quadrants. I don't want you to get lost in that, but there is some important information, especially as we start looking at interventions. We want to look at subjective interventions and objective interventions in order to raise consciousness and create a more integral city. So if you want to go back to this, essentially what we're looking at, we're going to be looking at 7 cities within a city. So the idea is that all of these worldviews, value memes, are within a city, and they actually function in some ways as different cities within a city. So as we go through them, listen for that and be asking yourself, this is a city within the city of Louisville. So I'm going to start with these lower worldviews. And so this lowest worldview, which sometimes they call beige, really is very primitive. Although, and you can see at the top that it's basically concerned with survival. Food, water, warmth, sex, and safety are the primary means. Now, in some areas of our city, these may really be the existential needs. And so, as Maslow's hierarchy of needs says, these are the lowest level of needs. And so a city always needs to be aware of these basic survival issues. And if it doesn't have things in place, then, the city really will be hindered in its growth. We don't really see this a lot. You may see it in just really impoverished areas, although you don't see this kind of worldview manifesting very much in urban areas.
Can I add something here, Judd?
Please.
About that while on a normal everyday we may not see this, as I was reading this, I was thinking about how no matter where we are in our city's center of gravity or personally, that think about Texas this past week. No electricity, no water, can't get it, which really drove, I think, that state down this ladder of development, so that because their health, their safety were threatened. I don't imagine that people were behaving terribly in it, but I'm sure a lot of these very fundamental parts of us were triggered down in Texas this past week.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great example of what happens and the need to regress to those issues. So moving up from that, what they call magenta, here is a little bit more complex. Here the thinking is animistic, magical spirits, good and bad. You can see this in very kind of tribal cultures. Kinship, family kinship is the main center of gravity. What this looks like in an urban area, and I'll be reading kind of at the bottom here from these slides, but here in urban areas, these were kind of deeply personal, spiritual places. Again, animism is that, there are spirits and animal in all things. But in a city, this is where it really manifests in these really particular places where families live. You may have tribal kind of communities. It's the need for having these kind of sacred, safe spaces that really make up a sense of comfort, and they're comforting to this worldview. It can be a very magical thinking worldview, but when you see in an urban space, it may be specific buildings or even kind of specific religious communities may have a need for this in an urban space. So it's very, very small group. Sometimes they're even just families, families that live together on a block, kind of meet this worldview's needs for those kinds of spaces. To move, in a minute, I'll show you some of the leadership. We don't really have a whole lot of leadership that comes out of those first 2 kind of worldviews. Here we begin to move into what we call red, and here you begin to see the percentage of population going up. And red is really the first emergence of a self distinct from the tribe. So this is where the sense of self emerges. It's once embedded in the tribe or the family. And it kind of emerges as a real powerful force. It's very impulsive, egocentric, heroic. Um, it does still believe in kind of mythic spirits, dragons, beasts, and you have to have more power than those things. You see this in the early cities in feudal lords protecting underlings in exchange for obedience and labor. You can see this in urban spaces in a lot of gang work. Everybody has their territory or their neighborhood, and it's really highly structured around power. The one who is in control is the one that has the most often physical power. And you can see neighborhoods. You can also see this, all over the city. It's not very protective. You can see this in suburbs, where suburbs put up huge fences around themselves. And they may have very hierarchical forms of, the most powerful person in the community. So it's not necessarily a specific area. We're not just talking about urban area. This kind of worldview exists in different places, but it creates these spaces around safety, defined and protected personal areas, private homes, factories, and also signs of power, physical power. The sticker, beware of gun owner, beware of the dog. These are all very red messages. Like if you come into this space, you could get physically hurt. And again, that's a psychological and important need that people have. So it's not to dismiss it in any way. It's just to name that there are urban areas where this type of environment is being created because it's a need. It's a value set that people have specifically around power, around hierarchy, and around safety. To look at some of these leaders, and I think this is really important, and when we're looking at integral interventions, if you are going to move and try to, for example, if we as a community want to move into gang neighborhoods, we are going to have to work with their leaders and it's usually the one that's the strongest, the one that could hurt you or kill you. And so to do interventions in these areas, you really do have to work with their hierarchy, and their hierarchy usually has to do with the person of power. And their ruling, their sense of power is very short term. It's very impulsive, very manipulative. They're concerned about their own safety and security needs. So anytime you work in that space, you have to identify their underlying value need and meet it. So they have to have a sense of moving towards safety. You have to work with their need for power. You don't go to the ones that are beneath them. They would see that as a threat. You have to meet them and reinforce that they are powerful in order for them to come along with your solutions. So, and again, you can see this in corporations or in, business. A lot of times their leaders are working from this kind of worldview action logic. So again, there you see some of the dynamics if you're going to work in this area of intervention. Beginning to move up from there, we move into amber, what we call blue. This is often in spiral dynamics called blue. Here you begin to see some kind of emergence away from this really strong I to more of a what they call a cool color, communal color blue that moves into often religious communities, that it turns to an all-powerful other or an ordering force outside of itself that helps it order its energy, its power, into some right and wrongs. It gets very concerned with right and wrong. This is where laws and rules and the police force really is the group that emerges out of this kind of modern day policing. And it's important to have, again, because it controls the impulsivity of red. And so you need a strong blue worldview in order to deal with red. If you don't have that, red will run amok. And this is really, I think, important for one of the things we see in the city today. We'll talk about green in a moment. Green has to be very careful that it doesn't center red and give red power, because it may say, oh, well, red's been oppressed, so it needs power. If you do that, red doesn't care. And it's very impulsive. And so these ideas about, oh, let's get rid of the police force is a very green idea, but it doesn't appreciate that we need blue. We need an ordering force to correct or to guide or to create rights and wrong for red impulsiveness. And we need this individually, right? That's where the super ego comes in as a functional part of the psyche, because it controls impulsivity of red. And you need that in a culture and in a community. So what this looks like in, the bottom paragraph here, in urban manifestations, it's well-established and carefully maintained areas and spaces for all aspects of living, carefully identified, controlled, and marked. There's certain parts of neighborhoods in Louisville that have been created off this model. Everything's right there in the neighborhood. Everything's well controlled. Everything's very ordered. It's it's very manicured. It's very safe, very protected. The church and the community all have a very similar worldview. It's not very diverse. And again, there's a need for that. I mean, those may sound like some critiques, but I don't mean them as critiques. I mean them to say people create these kind of environments because they have a psychological need for them. And so an integral city would make space for that, would have those kinds of environments where that worldview can feel safe and nurtured and healthy. Again, they call this the diplomat. If you're going to work with people that are in this area, then here are some of the characteristics of them: committed to routines. This is their leadership style. Avoids inner and outer conflict, conforms, works to group standards. They're often very supportive of institutions. They like institutions. The Catholic Church is a really good example of that in Louisville. It's got a lot of order. It has a kind of a mythic worldview. It's often very hierarchical. If you look at the Catholic, which is one of the largest religious institutions, it's very blue, and it meets the world view of people that are in that stage. And so I think this is a really important worldview for those of us in Louisville to work with. And again, these are not just Catholic, it's, Christian, that really finds security and safety in these kind of mythical religious beliefs. I don't mean religion completely. I mean those who hold a literal religion, or what we would call a mythic religion. So I think this is an important worldview for us to be aware of in Louisville, because a lot of people are working in this worldview, specifically religiously. Are there any of y'all that want to jump in, feel free to do that. If there's words of clarification or something comes up for you, feel free to do that. We have a couple more worldviews to look at before we have open conversation. So moving from blue is orange. And again, this is probably where the primary worldview is in the United States, definitely the most power. And this moves out of a kind of a blue communal mythical worldview into a scientific worldview. And that's kind of the main system that comes online here. It can be very rational, strategic, scientific. This kind of the emergence of universities, a lot of education, helping people think this way. It does manipulate resources for personal gain. So this is really the economic system that capitalism came out of. Socialism and communism really were blue, kind of blue, and we can look at those, we can parse those a little bit, but capitalism really began to emerge, industrial revolution, out of a scientific worldview when enough people had that worldview. So this is very success driven, very status image, very materialistic. But it's important because it creates systems so that people can gain wealth. And this is the real beauty of what this system offers, is the capacity for individuals to gain material wealth. And that's a lot of what it's ordered to do, or at least has the capacity to do. And that's really important in growing economies. Again, as you see it in the urban manifestation, high status areas of living and working, which have resulted from successful wealth creation, prosperous displays of wealth and affluence, image, downtown urban hubs, where the banks or highly successful companies have their buildings, and those are kind of status symbols. There are two leadership styles in Orange, kind of a pre-Orange and a post-Orange, or an initial stage of Orange. One's called the expert, and they are very interested in kind of factual information. Who's the expert? They spend a lot of time quoting experts, quoting those who know. Very concerned about, and integrates that. It integrates people who have been successful, a lot of kind of self-help or managerial kind of marketing, engineering, accounting happens in this initial. The second part of this, from the expert, it moves to what's called the achiever. And again, both of these are within the Orange worldview. The achiever is kind of an initial movement into green, but they can do long-term goals. They have a little more complexity to work with more complex organizations. They can see more complexity. You can see some of the characteristics down there at the bottom. Has a little more sense of self-awareness. Has a little more sense of diversity. This is really kind of where diversity begins to start becoming a concern for leaders. They can begin to see other people's perspectives. And so it's a little more advanced form of leader, even though it's still in the Orange worldview. Again, we see, I think, beginning to see some people moving to kind of the top of corporations that have this type of capacity, the achiever capacity. What we move to from there is what we call green. And green really is a movement back out of to we from the I of Orange. So it's much more communal, but it's communal in a sense of it's more integrated. It can really see it's the emergence of what we call the sensitive self. It begins to see more complex networks. It sees the environmental degradation that happened from Orange materialism. It is more interested in also marginalized groups of people that have been marginalized. It becomes very sensitive to the oppression of people, specifically from blue and from orange. And it begins to want to hear more people's opinions and decision making. It is environmentally more green, and we've seen this kind of emerge and where this looks in urban spaces. It's very open areas, rural and natural landscapes, places for people to come together around diversity. It is concerned about sustainability issues, harmony and relationships among people groups. A lot of our nonprofit world is led by people in these areas. A lot of nonprofit CEO folks are really in this kind of worldview. It's a much more sensitive, engaged, and concerned about peoples that have been oppressed. The leaders here, one of the things that begins to happen here is the movement from conventional to post-conventional. So they have this kind of emerging sense of doing things their own way. Sometimes there's an emergence of spirituality. In Louisville, we begin to see the emergence of this around the Compassion Louisville movement, which really began focusing on spirituality, leaders that were meditating, kind of a refreshed spirituality in leaders here, a sensitiveness, an empathy in leadership begins to emerge here, and a sense of authenticity. Sometimes you see corporate leaders in the midlife crisis leave corporate jobs and enter either nonprofit, or they enter, they kind of, they become more sensitive. And for a lot of men, this can kind of lead to a midlife crisis, so that they feel like their values may not be able to be expressed in their work anymore. They get interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. So the action logics here is what they call the individualist, a sense of their own internal self. A lot of times this really doesn't even emerge until midlife or afterwards as a stage, because you begin to feel the deeper sense of your soul's call to a certain kind of work, and are not caught up in just having to make money or be seen as successful. There's an authenticity that emerges here. So this is the first tier. Remember, we've talked about first tier leadership or first tier worldviews and second tier. The movement beyond this is really a movement, and I want to play this video. I hope you all will be able to hear this. I may have to, let me stop my screen share and come back to this. I want to play this because I didn't share it for sound. I want to make sure y'all can hear. This is a great example of green confronting orange. So listen to this conversation. Let me make sure you can hear.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it.
Can you hear that? Yeah. So this is Rutger Bregman. He wrote a book called Humankind. And he's speaking at a World Forum Economic Forum, and which is, very historically very orange. That's kind of where a lot of this came out of. So listen to these green comments as a critique to orange.
Quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water. This is not rocket science. Mm-hmm. We can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
I actually came because I do believe we have an issue here. But I have to say, honestly, this is a very one-sided panel. Frankly, what people really want is a dignity of a job. I'd like for the panel to talk about beyond taxes, which every one of you have talked about. The only thing you've talked about in this whole panel on inequality, what can we really do to help solve inequality over time beyond taxes?
Let me tell you something. We're talking about jobs, but the quality of those jobs. With poultry workers in the richest country in the world, the United States. Dolores, one woman we work with there, told us that she and her co-workers have to wear diapers to work because they are not allowed toilet breaks. This is in the richest country in the world. So don't tell me about low levels of unemployment. You are counting the wrong things. You're not counting dignity of people. You're counting exploited people.
I want to.
So, any I wanted to show you an example of worldviews having conflict with each other. So, and so you see these value systems at conflict with each other. And that's what we have in the whole first tier of worldviews. They all are critiquing the other ones. They all want everybody to be like them. They're not able to see the underlying codes and appreciate what the goodness that they bring to the whole spiral. And this really is what we mean by second tier. So if we move into a second tier, all of those can be seen, and all of the value systems, the value rankings there can be understood and appreciated. But before that, we just have all of this conflict around these different values. And so second tier, and let me, the movement into second tier really is the ability to see all of those and not get hooked by any of them. That you can see what they bring to the spiral. Green has a hard time seeing orange. In many ways, when we were talking about shadow earlier, one of the things you're likely to shadow is the value system that you just came out of, because you feel bad about it. So I think we really have to watch this, that a lot of times when you move into a different worldview, you're liable to shadow that part of the worldview that you just came out of. And you go so far in your critique of it that you're not able to bring forth the goodness of that worldview in yourself, and you become overcritical of it in the world. And this is what I think green has to be very careful of, is that it doesn't do away with the value of the economic growth and prosperity that orange really brought it. Now it can critique it, but it has to be very careful that it doesn't undermine it and therefore destroy the system of orange that really does create economic growth. I mean, however we like to see it, consumerism and capitalism has been the system that's brought the most people out of poverty. Now, we may not like what it's done, and we may have critiques, and we want to help it be healthy capitalism, but none of the other world systems, economic systems, have been as effective at bringing people out of poverty. Now, and we hear the green critique, right? Well, it's oppressing people. That is true. It's still oppressing people, but it's still a system, at least in the world today, that has brought the most people out of poverty. So anyway, a teal can see all of that, and it can work with all of that. So one of the questions we need to ask in Louisville is, where are all these different cities in Louisville? Which ones need attention because we as a city are being blocked from our evolution? And a teal worldview can really see that, and it can appreciate it. So it's very reflective. It wants to get information from a lot of different spaces. And the difference between teal leadership, well, this is what it looks like. It looks like a balanced systemic integration of different spatial needs and requirements to provide a dynamic, chaotic, which is, the word chaotic is a mix between order and chaos. Diverse spatial environments of nodes and networks, which grows, adapts, and develops to meet all needs without threatening its own sustainability and ability to change and adapt changing urban areas of growth and regrowth. So you see, it's very complex. It's able to see these and understand these flows, and then find integral solutions to that. This is an action logic. They call it the strategist. And again, the strategist you can find all over the places. They can be in corporations and city government, nonprofits. It's people that really are taking a 30,000 foot view of Louisville and then moving strategically to those places that need to be healthy. And we can see this emerging some in Louisville. And is what I'm talking about is what we need to cultivate, people that are strategists for an integral city. The difference between that and what we call turquoise, the turquoise worldview, I think is the emergence of not only the ability to see the city with your mind, but to feel it with your heart. In other words, can your heart open up and feel the energies of the city? I'll also think, and this is kind of an emerging theory, I wonder if people at Turquoise are able to dream the dreams of the city, so that their awareness, their sense of self expands, so they're not just looking at their tribe, their community, their corporation, their area, neighborhood. They're actually able to feel the city as it emerges as the city. And I mean, to be real honest, this is where I'm really interested in exploring what would a community of practice look like that not only tried to see the city intellectually or structurally, but could actually learn to feel the city and could open up our unconscious to the soul of the city that emerges in intuition and dreams that could receive what we'll call teleological images for the city's wholeness. And I don't know where this exists in Louisville. And so it needs to get created. A group of people that are trying to feel and understand the city at this level. Because if we don't have this community of practice, we can't work at a really integrated level. We'll get caught in one of these other levels, and its agenda will become our agenda. So that's my plea for why we're doing what we're doing, and my hope for cultivating an integral city. Again, what we have to look at if we're going to do strategic thinking and integral interventions is we have to see these basic life conditions and problems, and we have to change those in order that these value systems may come on board so that behaviors and artifacts might get created that hold that level of consciousness. And we need each of the worldviews to be able to be healthy enough to do this so that they're a healthy manifestation of themselves, because we need all of them. So I'm done. That's it. I apologize. That was a lot of stuff. But again, these maps are important, not because you need to memorize them, but just because we need to try to look at all of these different lenses in order to create integral approaches to being a city. So I'm going to open it up now. I don't know if you've got thoughts, comments, or I hope you do, or what you're feeling right now. So let's just open it up to some questions, and then we'll get into a little bit of conversation. So I'm trusting my conversation partners here to jump in. And if there's something on Facebook, please put in a question there and we'll bring it into the conversation.
Do you have any idea of, when you talk about the 7 cities within Louisville, the 7 worldviews, is where the ratios lie? Like, do you feel like we're 30% blue and 20, and I know these are just rough numbers, but any sense of where you think the city resides? Because we have to talk to the different worldviews with different language, unless you are really, as you say, a spiral wizard where you can encapsulate in your language all these different worldviews.
Yeah, I think, and when they have some maps that you can do, like overlay maps of like which ways to look at that. I think, Louisville's primarily grounded in our city government and in the people that have power in orange, that have some leanings towards green. And those are the people with the power. I think that really is the center of gravity, orange leaning to green. And I think that will be Louisville's next kind of evolutionary center of gravity change will be to green. And we begin to see some of that happening. And, that's really beautiful. And there's some challenges that come along with green that I think we need to be very aware of. But, I think our government, our city government right now is really centered in green. Although one of the things that happened, I think, is with the racial injustice. I mean, one of the maps I wanted to show you in Louisville, if we want to start pulling in Louisville maps to ask those questions, there's a map that shows the city of Louisville by life expectancy. And there are two neighborhoods that are right across from each other, Smoketown and the Highlands, where there's a 12-year life expectancy between a white man and a black man in those neighborhoods. So a white man living in the Highlands will live 12 years longer than a black man living in Smoketown. So, I mean, what that disparity says is there's a huge group that's hurting in Louisville. And we begin to see that it's not just racial, although the racial lens is really important. There are people in Louisville that don't have access to basic needs. And until Louisville addresses that, I don't think we're going to evolve as a community until the racial issue, specifically Black and I would say immigrant Black and brown people have access to economic growth. That is the fulcrum point. In my discernment, that's the fulcrum point for Louisville to evolve. So it needs to figure out how the rest of the spiral brings its resources to that. That's my kind of evaluation. Again, other people may have a different sense of that, and I would be very interested in y'all's sense of that. But I think that the life expectancy, 11 to 12 years difference, that's huge. I mean, and we see the complexity of, right? So it's health, it's economics, it's housing, it's income, it's food. But I think those are the complexities of our city right now. That's why I think the green environmental movement that Green is also interested in is important, but that's not where I think we need to put our energy right now. And all my environmentalist friends are gonna, I'm not saying it's not important. I just don't think that's where the energy needs to be of our city, because green environmental concern is a fairly high level of a value system that people that don't have food don't really care about. Not that they don't have the capacity to care about it. It's just that it's not an existential need for them. If you meet the need for their food, safety, and security, then they're liable to begin to ask other questions like issues of sustainability.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking through this because obviously there's going to be different worldviews across the city, right? There's definitely going to be red, the blue, along with the, obviously you're making a hypothesis that Louisville is center of gravity at orange. And I'm just wondering if it's really about moving the city from orange to, are you saying that you'd like to see it to move to what? Teal, turquoise, skip over
Well, you
green?
can't skip over green. It'll have to go through green. Yeah, so the center of gravity will have to move to green.
Because I'm just wondering also too, that do you focus on the center of gravity from orange to green, but there's also the work to be done at the other stages, right? So thinking about the red to the blue to the orange, and what that looks like as far as, you know, thinking about meeting people where they're at. And so thinking about a talent development perspective and looking at a strengths-based approach, thinking about, you know, looking at red and where they're at and the assets that they bring to the table and developing from that perspective. So yeah, I'm just curious, you know, how you are able to approach the different types of worldviews, or is it more of a, and I don't want to use this word because, but more of a focused approach on orange as a city, or is it there multiple approaches?
Well, I think Integral needs to take the gifts of orange, specifically its capacity to raise wealth, and it needs to apply it to red, so that red can move into blue and blue can move into orange. So that's and I think the challenge is those that are in green have shadowed orange capitalism, and I think that's a mistake, because I think they need the resources of orange capitalism. And I maybe speaking as a nonprofit leader, I think that's where we need corporate involvement, that gets focused by green, towards red, and red and blue, you know, have some overlays, I think, with race in Louisville, because that's been an oppressed group. So again, you could take race, and you could, you know, race is not the same thing as worldview. So there are people in, you know, all races and all those worldviews. And yet I think they're, you know, one of the things we're looking about with violence right now is we're looking at, a lot of it's been gang violence, that a lot of the shootings that have happened, 172 deaths and from gun violence last year. And most of those were, you know, kind of what we would call group, related, neighborhood gang related. And so what do we do about that? How, if that's 170, like, yeah, that's 170. So what's happening? That's red. It's red that's doing a lot of that. So how do you, and the idea of getting away from having a police force, or that the police don't need to be a part of that solution, I think is the real challenge. That green, that's my concern. What I hear from coming from green right now is they just want to do away with policing. Now, I'm not saying that the police force doesn't have to be changed in radical ways, but we do have to work with that as an entity, because it's very important that entity be there, and that it be healthy. And, you know, of course, I think the police reform and all of those things that we're talking about are essential to that work. I think we just have to be really careful when we talk about defunding the police. I think there's some sense to that in certain ways, but not getting rid of, the police force as we know it.
So
and that's where I get a
to-
lot of pushback from other areas, which I appreciate, but I think from an integral perspective, yeah. So Wes, jump in.
I think in particular with the idea of the police, defunding the police, abolishing the police is a fair assessment to make or demand, because what the police represent from their genesis is the policing of Black bodies. And that supports all of the negative impacts that took place during a stage of Orange or during the genesis of capitalism in this country, where certain bodies were ascribed value and others were given authority to police that value. So we kind of throw it away in that sense. But you have to think about, I'm thinking, as we move through these different stages, it's kind of like walking through mud, where you can't really walk through a place without some of it getting caught in your boot, or you're walking through a brush and you got, leaves and twigs caught to you. And that reminded me of the statement that you made with regard to the shadow of the value systems that you just came out of being kind of, I guess, a person's vice in this new system. And in our country, if you look at those two together, wealth is defined as your proximity from poverty, not to poverty. So even and that controls your access to capital, resources that are sustainable, resources that are given in a non-paternalistic fashion that really allow people to move from one area to the next. And just to kind of juxtapose that to our green aspirations, where let's say the EPA is the police for the environment. If the EPA was truly doing their job in enforcing those environmental policies, we may not have a difference in life expectancy between a smoke town or a highlands, because we're not dealing with violence that comes just in the form of a gun, but it's environmental, it's educational, it's systemic. And when these compound, it's a really heavy load to drag through some mud, and then not at some point have some bitterness towards the area you just left, or the people in that area who couldn't figure out the lock and key like you did, or because access to another area, a higher stage, often requires you to disregard or not, or show this how much you are not like what you just came from or where you just came from. And that creates an environment where people don't necessarily want to remember, so they lose the values as they transition, or they're adopting new value systems as they transition. So they'll take the benefits of the Orange stage, the ideas of wealth creation, the ideas of rationalism and scientific resources and resource allocation, but they'll forget the synthesis of that and all the issues that happened in its genesis. Yeah.
No, thank you, Wes. Great analysis. Yeah.
Well, I think that's getting at the, the question of power dynamics. And I definitely agree with what Wes is putting out there, because, the Orange is really tied up into if we think about power dynamics within this lens of these different worldviews, there's very much still a red manifestation that is coming through the Orange. Orange only understands scientific rationality through hierarchy and power, which is in this the red worldview, right? And so Orange has emerged out of and has manifested through the idea of hierarchy and self-interest and power over as opposed to power with. So I think there's something to tease out a little bit more when thinking about, stages of development and having to go to the next and through to the next. I think last week, the, integral politics and integral economics, I think those are two very really great works to dig into a little bit more, which I think what I was pulling out is understanding, again, more of that strengths-based approach that, you know, really focusing on the positive manifestations that the different worldviews bring to the table, and how we can really emphasize those positive manifestations as a way to integrate. Because yes, I definitely think orange is very much a manifestation of red, at least within the our context of the US, but you can probably see it, you know, in other areas of the world as well, thinking through, again, the power dynamics lens.
Thanks, Alicia. David, what's percolating with you?
I'm enjoying the depth of the three of you and how you bring kind of new insights to me. I feel kind of ignorant on some of these topics, so it's healthy for me to hear you. And when I asked the question around where you thought Louisville was, you spoke to the government, where the government was. My question was really about the city in general. You know, because and wondering about what are the leverage points to have the biggest impact. You know, is the biggest impact, like Alicia just said, you know, is like you emphasize the positive of all the worldviews. Well, that's a strong, okay, that's where we need to put energy, you know, as an example. Or do we first have to talk to those that are in power to soften them up so that there's a willingness to share power? You know, so how do we bring along the orange within the governmental and the business systems? I don't know, but what's going in my mind is how to take the intellectual understanding of integral and, you know, the depth of understanding that, say, the three of you have, and actually how do you actualize that into the community? How does it inform us about how to take action in the most productive way for the benefit of all 7 cities? Because all 7 have a right to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
ruminating on.
Yeah. So that's where, and I wish we had more time, because then, so I did some work with this most intentionally on the issue of immigration back when I was working at Kentucky Refugee Ministries, and was interested in how you message immigration reform and immigration policy using the value set of different groups. And so we worked on some different kind of campaigns. One is, you know, really pushing on the statistical information that came out about why immigrants were good for the economy. And that was really a powerful message from green to orange, using orange's language set. And then we would find professional people that were highly respected, either in education or in business, to be outspoken about the need for an open immigration policy. And so that's a strategic way. And a lot of times we start talking about language that you want to use to move your agenda forward. So you would have to drop into, so when we got into it with the church, we didn't use economics. We started quoting scriptures from their traditions that talked about the stranger or the alien in your midst is the one that you should be caring about. You know, so a literal interpretation of the scripture, and you can find it in the mosque, and you can find it in the Quran, you can find it in the Bible, you know, new Greek scriptures, Hebrew scriptures, where they're being told you're supposed to care for people that are immigrants, because that may be God. You know, that's an angel coming to you for your own transformation. Or, you know, the story of Mary and Joseph, you know, who were immigrants, and they got, they had a place that received them, you know. So there's all kind of messaging. So you use their value set, you use their sources of authority to frame your policy message so that they can hear it. So that's kind of an example, David, of using. First, you have to figure out where is the biggest need. You know, where do we feel like there's the most brokenness, or a worldview is not healthy, and do we see the scaffolding? Where is there a missing link in the scaffolding, and then how do you message that to the population that you're talking about?
Thanks. And the other thing that came up for me as you were talking is I felt some fear come up that integral in undeveloped hands can be very dangerous. It can use integral understanding, which I think is already out there in politics, frankly. They may not have maybe the structure of the model per se, but they are sure enacting through it. To simply manipulate. You know, we could use integral as a tool to get what our needs are, whatever they are, wherever we are sitting in life, and just manipulate by using language in a strategic, self-centered way. So I just felt some like, oh, we need to be a little bit careful and humble in how we use integral.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I'd love to add something to that, David, because I was thinking when it was moving from the beige stage to where society started to function with religions. I was thinking, what do we have when people deal with politics as if it's a religious institution? You know, that's a whole nother power dynamic within itself. And that makes the work even harder, because then people can't separate the needs of others from, I guess, in a personal, spiritual attack on the foundation of a part of themselves.
Yeah.
Gets back to, identity, right?
There's a lot of identity politics going on here, and our personal politics can't really be detached from our body politics. So we're left being defined before we open our mouths a lot of the times.
Yeah. Which then circles back to what I'm thinking about, Alicia, and what you were talking about, awareness. Can we even see our tendency to do some of these things? And, what is the quality of people's awareness of those people in power? Can they see how they're being influenced and impacted by their particular system they're sitting in?
So true, because you both have to be aware. You have to choose to be aware at a high level and then use that information for the next actionable step. It's easy to just ignore a lot of things that make us uncomfortable, that don't favor our agenda. And it's like writing your conclusion, then trying to backtrack, reverse engineer the hypothesis.
Yeah, go look for the facts afterwards.
Well, and you all are talking about, I think, what you're naming these different lines of development. So you could have a really high level of cognitive development, but a low level of moral development, because those are measuring different things. They don't develop at the same pace. So you may have a high level of ability to use integral thinking, but your application of it is limited to your moral capacity. How many people do you hold in your heart and in your moral concern? And that may be very limited. You may be able to use all this information, but it's for your tribe or people who look like you or think like you.
We call the intellectual understanding of integral as being integrally informed, because there's an awful lot of folks that I bump into that believe they're integral because they have an integral understanding, when their embodiment of integral is not even close. And when I say integral here, I'm talking about second tier integral. Like, have they really grown into that, Or can they just talk the talk, but not walk it?
Well, I'm a great example of that. I mean, I got into integral back when I was in college, and I knew my application of it was much more limited, and even became a tool for my own shadowing of aspects of my behavior. That's like, you know, just because I know a lot of psychological theory doesn't mean I practice it. Right. So it's and you find that a lot as well. Like have psychological knowledge, all these tools and practices, but that doesn't mean I apply them. And again, that's where we begin working at these deeper questions of one's own ego. And what are the tools of integral leadership or integral spirituality that allow us to expand our hearts and minds? So we're about out of time, good people. I want to thank you for what I'd like to do is just give us a moment of kind of silence or a moment to just reflect and then ask you all to check out. But what, if you can kind of connect to your heart, what are you feeling about what we've been talking about today, or maybe the last couple of weeks? Another question is, what is what we're learning and feeling inviting us to do or to be? So you have a sense of what you're being invited to do or to be because of our conversation. So we've got about 6 minutes left, which is about a minute and a half for each of us to check out. A minute and a half, 2 minutes. So who's at a place where you would like to check out?
Over the weekend, I watched Judas and the Black Messiah. It's the story of Fred Hampton and his assassination as leader of the Black Panther Party. And the echoing theme that I left that experience with was that I am a revolutionary. And when I think about how we engage this community and all communities, I think that it's integral to have a little bit more of a revolutionary politic and in a way of engaging that really considers how far from the norm can we go? How much can we deconstruct the system that we live in to rebuild it better, more equitable for all of us? And it's definitely integral to even have that thought. And we don't really get to any of these other spaces sometimes without recognizing that we have to change, and that changing who we are or reflecting on our values enough to change them is necessary. It'll help us uncover our shadows, reveal what our true value systems are, and we should all be revolutionaries in that way.
Thank you,
Love the
Wes.
spirit of your heart, Wes.
Thank you. It's been great having this time with you all.
Yeah, me too.
David or Alicia?
Yeah, that's great, Wes. I appreciate that checking out, because as I've mentioned, I still am trying to think through power dynamics and the resistance work that is, I think, important when, when thinking about the different worldviews. And I guess maybe it's the pathological parts of the different worldviews. But as far as checking out, I think what David was getting at with the embodiment piece, I think I really appreciate, and I know Judd was just talking about the turquoise level being at more of the heart-centered level of understanding and a worldview that incorporates the mind, the heart, and and I guess I would also say the hands, and that really requires continuous practice and continuous learning and showing up and commitment each and every day, because the struggle, you know, it's really hard and challenging and uncomfortable, and that's what is, I guess, part of the work is to really, and part of transformation is being uncomfortable and being okay, being comfortable with uncomfortable, right? And how we can get people to open up to that transformation process, because it is messy, it is uncomfortable, and that's what it's all about. And so making sure that there's support systems to help people in their own shadow work, I think is going to be very, very important. And so equipping integral leaders with the capacity to support shadow work is just something that also popped up for me in the earlier discussion. So I'll check out with the idea of embodiment that I'll add to the other points that I started off with in the beginning of the session. So thank you. It's been a pleasure, Wes, David, and Judd, as always.
Thank you, Alicia. David?
Yeah. So what sits with me is, and Judd, you know some of the story here, but while I'm doing some work in leadership development, that since retiring 2 years ago, I've been pushing and prompting myself to say, you know, what is it that I care about enough to move me, to put me in a place of engagement in a different way, and taking some steps to get closer to the fire, to feel my care and feel what's important to me and what I want to stand for and contribute to. So what comes up in these 4 sessions is there is I'm feeling an energy around this topic, and just, if nothing else, how it's engaged the 4 of us, and I feel like connected in that and hopeful in that, and it just feels like the 4 sessions have helped to crack my door open a little bit further. So I'm appreciative of being asked and to be on the panel with the 3 of you.
Right. Thank you, Dave. Yeah. I think what's coming up for me is I want to take this energy of red in me, this anger, this energy, or this, energy of red. I want it to flow through this moral certainty of the, the Christian tradition of blue, of the Jesus of blue. I want it to focus on the wealth and resources of orange, mine and my communities, and I want to engage people with the sensitivity of green in order to cultivate essentially economic development in the Black and brown community. That's what it feels like is my focus right now. So that's the way I want to pull all of these parts of myself and honor all of them, and then use them hopefully in an integrated way over the next couple of years. That's what feels like is my call. So yeah, deeply appreciative of you all as partners, and again, kind of a jump into what it might look like to create an integral community of practice, or whatever we want to. They also call it mesh working, which I'm really interested in that term, because it talks about different sectors horizontally and different vertical worldviews, the ability to mesh, to work at all these different kind of places. So thank all of you. Deep bow to you, my friends. And next time we get together, maybe offline, where we can all see each other face to face and continue the great conversation. For those of you that have been watching us on Facebook, thanks for being here. And again, you can look at all the videos. We'll put them up on Interfaith Paths to Peace, and you can download them or look at them there if you missed any of them. Thank you, Wes, David, Alicia. Be well, and we'll see you all on the other side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Peace.